Outsiders was one of the first shows to bring worldwide attention to the plight of Peter Ridd, a scientist and an expert on the Great Barrier Reef, who criticised those academics who proclaim that the reef is dying because of man-made climate change. And subsequently, he lost his job. A court recently found he had been unfairly dismissed and awarded him damages of over $1 million, which the university is currently appealing. Outsiders was also one of the first shows to repeatedly highlight in our Ice Age Watch segment the great work of Dr. Susan Crockford, a Canadian academic who not only says that polar bears are thriving, but who also belled the cat, as it were, on David Attenborough's fraudulent recent use story about dead walruses. Last week, Dr. Crockford was fired. Yep, Susan Crockford was an adjunct professor at Canada's University of Victoria, but in what sounds like a very familiar and very sinister tune, she has lost her job because of her work on polar bears. Dr. Crockford, an expert on mammals, has shown that polar bears are thriving, with populations reaching levels not seen for decades. Her views have put her into conflict with radical environmentalists and political allies who have been promoting the idea that polar bears are in imminent danger of extinction. Dr. Susan Crockford joins us live now from London. Susan, how are you?
I'm just fine, thank you.
Listen, terrible to hear your plight. Tell us the story, what has happened between you and the university, and then tell us about polar bears.
Well, what really happened was that I wasn't, an adjunct professor position is actually an unpaid. It's an unpaid position, and so what happened was I wasn't actually fired. It's just that position was not renewed. And so it is a slightly different kind of predicament than Peter Ridd was in, but the underlying issue that is the same for both is that of academic freedom. And the university did prevent me from exerting my academic freedom in this case.
Now, talk to us about one of your books. You've written several books and papers and articles, but the one that I'd urge people to read is The Polar Bear Catastrophe That Never Happened. So we all remember the stories, the photos of the starving polar bear who was a symbol of global warming. You went out to actually research polar bears. Tell us about your research.
Well, what I actually did was looked at the predictions that were made by American biologists in 2007 and compared those predictions to observations of how polar bears have been doing since 2007. Now, what actually happened was that the summer sea ice declined decades sooner than the sea ice experts had predicted. And so what we have are observations of what the bears had been doing, and it turns out that instead of declining by 2/3, the bears actually increased slightly in population size. In other words, the bears had actually survived the massive decline in sea ice that had predicted to almost wipe them out.
So so why was this controversial? So you spoke about the polar bears actually doing well. Why was this so controversial in environmental climate change circles?
Well, I'm not really sure, partly because I think that the polar bear has been this icon for climate change, and so some of the specialists that have been working on the aspect have really not been willing to let it go and to admit that their prediction has been wrong. And the fact that their prediction was wrong, what it tells us that, in fact, the bears are much more adaptable and flexible in their ability to deal with reduced summer sea ice than anyone had expected.
Now, you also, Susan, drew our attention earlier in the year to Sir David Attenborough's claim about walruses that walruses were dying because of climate change, because they couldn't find any ice, so they were going onto rocks and plunging to their deaths. Tell us your response to that story.
Well, really, that's the background for that story is that, in fact, walruses fall from cliffs on a routine basis, and it really has nothing to do with lack of sea ice or climate change. And what I did was look back into the scientific literature and found the descriptions of walruses falling off cliffs and enormous herds of walruses gathering on beaches that have all been blamed on climate change. But in fact, these are just natural occurrences for walrus and really have nothing to do with lack of sea ice.
Rita?
Why is there such hostility to, because you're coming from a position of, like you said, the research, the scientific data, you're an expert in this field. So if you're introducing new facts into the discussion, why are you met with this hostility, and why has it led to this position not being renewed?
Well, I don't really understand it, quite honestly, because the fact that the bears are thriving at the moment is really not a contentious issue. In 2015, the IUCN Red List estimated that the size of global polar bear populations was between 22,000 and 31,000. Well, that's not anywhere close to the few hundred to a few thousand that many teachers and other people assume that is left for polar bears. So all I really have been doing is calling attention to a reality that no one disputes. But I think it's because the polar bear has been elevated to this position of icon for climate change. And that is the reason that it has got people's backs up.
And Dr. Susan Crockford, so that's exactly the point, that the polar bear is a symbol of climate change. Therefore, when you go against the narrative, you're demonised by academia to a certain extent. Susan, we've actually got a bad line, so we're going to have to leave it there for this moment. Best luck with all your work and your travels, and we look forward to hearing more about the polar bears who are thriving in ever greater numbers. Dr. Susan Crockford, thanks so much for coming on Outsiders this evening.